Dos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our plenary talk of the afternoon. I'm going to introduce the speaker, Professor Francisco Ocampo Torres. He got his PhD from the Oceanography Department at the University of Southampton in 1989. He has more than 40 years experience with studies at surface wave dynamics and related processes. He's author and co-author of more than 40 scientific articles published in peer-reviewed journals, mainly associated with ocean surface wave dynamics and applications, RC interaction with emphasis in carbon dioxide and momentum transfer between the ocean and atmosphere. Research interest is very much related to perform detailed observations of the most relevant physical variables associated with the dynamics of the sea surface, making use of modern devices ranging from ADCP and turbulent velocity detectors to optical cameras and radars on board of satellites or airplanes, as well as deployed along the coast. More recently, with great interest in ocean wave energy and the potential conversion to practical uses, dealing with resources evaluation and with the development of experiments in the laboratory and at sea, to make progress on designing and building new devices to convert the ocean wave energy. Supervisor or co-supervisor of about 30 graduate students, 11 PhD, and 21 Master of Sciences. He's an active member of the Waves in Shallow Environments group since 1994, and of its scientific committee since 2014, member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences since 2000, and of the Mexican National Assistance for Researchers at level 3 since 2016. On a personal note, I think that the oceans in Mexico is a very important field of study, and I am very grateful that Paco accepted our invitations to deliver this talk. So you are very welcome, and please start with your talk. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for this introduction, and especially for this opportunity that you can provide us in order to have you an idea of what we are doing in the Waves group regarding ocean surface waves and ocean atmosphere interactions. I would like to acknowledge and thanks Julieta Castro and Amaranta Ruiz for their great support, mainly in logistics and administrative procedures. This research is a contribution from CONACYT CENER projects and also CONACYT Basic Science project. The contents of this talk is I'm going to give you briefly motivation and the relevance of ocean surface wave dynamics, why we study ocean surface waves, and I'm also giving you some background, mainly results from a classic laboratory, essentially on CO2 and water exchange, and also from a field experiment, so-called INTOA experiment, with some very relevant results. In the second part of the talk, I will address the new opportunity that we have in order to measure air-sea interaction processes. And I'll provide you with some preliminary results from recent experiments, recent deployments in the Gulf of Mexico. And I certainly will talk about the research work and the progress in our group. And also I will mention and indicate specific challenges in our research, essentially associated with applied maths. And finally, I'll give you an idea of next steps and final comments. So the motivation in the research group that we have relies on essentially recognizing the relevance of ocean surface wave dynamics and ocean surface waves by itself, mainly in air-sea interaction processes. These are fundamental aspects for many present challenges, say weather, climate and its changes, Ocean surface waves are obviously very important for maritime operations, and recently regarding energy from the oceans, because ocean wave power and energy is one of the most important energy sources, renewable sources from the sea. So there is an interlink, very strong interlink between the lower atmosphere and the ocean surface waves. That just there where it is the sea surface. There is momentum transfer between the two more important fluids in the planet, air and water. There is also gas transfer. And in the upper uh, layer of the ocean, there are ocean surface currents and turbulence that are essential for all those present challenges like weather, climate, and maritime applications. So therefore, we know that better knowledge is desired and it is needed. So we have now a great opportunity to study and observe the oceans by direct measurements and also from the space. From the typical point of view, say traditional relevance of ocean surface waves is in coastal and oceanic engineering. We all know that to design and build coastal infrastructure, information about the waves is really important. It is essential. Also in oceanic engineering, platforms are also requiring wave information in order to be designed and built. And for marine operations, all operations in platform, for instance, requires not only about the knowledge of the wave height and other relevant variables associated to the ocean surface waves, but also a good prediction or forecast is really required. In other aspect, also traditional classical importance of ocean waves is on ship design and construction. But more recently, we know that ocean surface waves are really important. And with this transparency, I would like to stress that idea. So why there is an importance of measuring and studying ocean surface waves? Say, sorry. No sé, ¿están viendo mi presentación?
Yes, it's correct. La vemos.
Pero yo no la veo. Caray. So with this idea, I'll try to make it clearer. Say, on average, the oceans. Sorry. No. Sorry about that. So on average, the ocean absorbs more than 2.5 times the incoming solar radiation than does the atmosphere. The energy from the warm ocean surface is transferred to the atmosphere by infrared radiation and by sensible and latent heat transfer. Therefore, the atmosphere, to a large extent, is heated from below. Then, zonal differences in heating and Earth's rotation drive the large-scale atmospheric circulation from which the oceans acquires most of their energy and momentum. So finally, we can say that the energy originally provided by the sun is in one form or another crosses the Earth-Sea interface at least 3 times before becoming the kinetic energy of oceanic waves and currents. So the main importance of the sea surface is that energy is transferred across the surface many times, at least 3 times before directly becoming the kinetic energy of oceanic waves and currents. And it is the sea surface where the waves are lying there. So that's why is the importance of the ocean surface waves. And this transfer that we are talking about, of course, is going to be very different if we consider the sea surface as a smooth surface or very gently rough, compared to a very high wave surface with even breaking. So we better know the character of the ocean surface waves in order to understand and clearly study the transfer between the ocean and the atmosphere. For instance, in the case of gases, a very simple conceptual air-sea interaction model is given in this transparency. We can say that the concentration of any gas above the sea surface, away from the sea surface, can be considered as constant in the vertical, and also below the sea surface, away from the sea surface, is also constant by different concentration. But near the sea surface, near the surface interface, there is a sharp increase, sharp gradient of the concentration, because there is a tendency to be in equilibrium, the gas above and below. So there is a very thin sublayer, diffusive sublayer, with a very sharp gradient in concentration. And it is within these diffusive sublayers where the resistance to transfer of any property relies. So you can obviously think that any process that disturbs this diffusive sublayer could modify or modulate the transfer at a whole. And for instance, in many numerical models, climate models or circulation models, they really rely on bulk aerodynamic formula. And this bulk aerodynamic formula is a rather crude approximation of the flux. In this case, we have H, the heat flux, E for the evaporation, and F for a gas flux. So the models rely on this expression on the right, where you can use rather simple variables like mean wind speed and temperature, potential temperature, and so on, to estimate the flux. But in a proper way, the flux can be determined directly if we consider the vertical turbulent of the wind component and also the turbulent component of the temperature for the case of heat. Or we can also define the evaporation if we consider the vertical turbulent component of the wind and turbulent component of humidity. And also we can express the flux of a gas. We consider the turbulent component of wind and concentration of that gas. But in the models, it is rather difficult to deal with a turbulent variable. So what they do is to rely on this bulk formula and rely essentially on these coefficients which are equivalent to a exchange coefficient of the property that we are dealing with. And this exchange coefficient can also be described in terms of the transfer velocity, which is K in this lower part. So this is an example of what transfer velocity of carbon dioxide is described as a function of wind speed, U10. And you can see in these results from Donnelan and Wanninkoff that depending on the experiment, depending on the data set, depending on the theoretical analysis, you could deal with either 10 centimeters per hour as transfer velocity, up to 40 when considering, for instance, a mean wind speed of 10 meters per second. So you can see now that if the model, depending on what the model considers as the transfer velocity of CO2 as a function of wind speed, even for a case of specific 10 meters per second wind speed, the model will be choosing between 10 or nearly 40 centimeters per hour. So at the end of iterations and time, the climate that is predicted in this model will be very different depending on what K or transfer velocity is considering. So that's why it's really important to understand better the transfer between air and sea of CO2, and essentially to look at these transfer velocities when not only wind speed is dealing with, but also ocean surface waves. So to get this a little bit more clear, I'm gonna show you some classic or historical results that we obtained in a so-called gas transfer flume, where we have wind imposed by a fan on the upper tunnel, and we have waves in this water tank. So we measure the waves at station 1, 2, and 3, and we also measure the CO2 in station 2 of simultaneously within the water and within the air. So we run a series of experimental tests, and for each particular wind speed, we inject CO2 in the water. We close the flaps to make the system tightly closed, and did the measurements to obtain at each experiment one value for the exchange. So the results, as a summary, is this plot for the carbon dioxide Dalton number as a function of wind speed. And we can see clearly that the exchange coefficient Dalton number for CO2 decreases with the wind increases from 1 meter per second up to 3 meters per second. And for higher wind speeds, the exchange coefficient increases slightly, not linearly, but with the wind speed. The results for each symbol is for one particular experiment. So we did many experiments covering a wind speed range from 1 to 16 meters per second. We also obtained results for evaporation. So this is the Dalton number for water. And we can also observe that the exchange coefficient decreases with wind speed from 1 meter per second to 3 meters per second. Also, the exchange coefficient increases not as regularly as the CO2 case, but also with wind speed from the minimum to the maximum wind speed when we reach nearly 16 meters per second. And we had the measurements of the waves in the tank, and the results are these in terms of the mean square slope of the surface. And as you can see, in low wind from 1 meter per second through to 3 meters per second, apparently or practically there were no waves. The mean square slope was practically nil, and suddenly increases when the wind increased up to 6 or 7 meters per second. And the increase for further wind speed or higher wind speed is not as strongly than for moderate wind speeds, but also is increasing. So what this tells us is that it's not only wind speed, what it is important for the exchange coefficient to determine the exchange coefficient, but also the character of the ocean surface waves. We did some measurements in the field, in the coastal region in Todos Santos Bay, with an ADCP to measure the waves about 2 or 3 kilometers from the coast. And we had a EC tower, eco-variance tower, just looking at the ocean, looking at the surface of the ocean to estimate the CO2 fluxes. So the results are these. the time series of wind speed from May 14 to May 15. Sorry, May 2014 to May 2015. So we managed to estimate the fluxes in a wide variety of conditions of wind speed, from practically zero wind speed to up to 13 or 12 meters per second. So this is the result for fluxes. The blue, so the blue or green-blue dots, and for CO2 concentration in the air, the gray dots. What it is important here is that we managed to establish a relation between the fluxes as a function of wind speed, water temperature, significant wave height, and steepness of the waves present near shore. And what we observed essentially is that in not many of the variables, there was a correlation between the flux and the variable in considering, except that wind speed, slightly variation, and more importantly, the significant wave height. Of course, depending on the quantile regression analysis that we did. So with this, we can say that at least we have some basic ideas of the CO2 transfer between the ocean and the atmosphere. It is already established that the transfer to CO2 is water phase resistance, but we are mostly interested in the influence of waves. So we relied on laboratory measurements and measurements in a coastal site. But still the challenge is to use the method, the eddy covariance method, to estimate directly the CO2 flux at the ocean. So this is one of the challenges that we have still to cover. So in another specific area, I'd like to tell you about an experiment that we did in the Gulf of Tehuantepec. And in this area, there is an offshore wind that imposes very characteristic dynamics in the ocean. Not only that we observe eddies around, like we can see here, by a picture of an idea of the productivity that we have in the ocean, but also because the wind during certain events is very strong coming from the north. And this wind, which is called Tehuano event or Tehuano wind, generates waves locally. And as you may know, all the South of Mexico coast receive long waves from the south, from storms in the South Pacific or Antarctic Ocean. So these long waves that coming from the south are directly in opposite direction than the waves which are locally generated by the Tehuano events. So this makes a very particular site of experiment. So we deployed an air sea interaction spar buoy in 2005 to measure wind speed and surface waves and the buoy motion, and other parameters like atmospheric pressure or air and water temperature and so on. With this particular type of buoy, it is possible to obtain through the eddy covariance method or eddy correlation method, the surface stress or momentum exchange. So after the measurements of wind velocity and surface heights were corrected by the motion of the structure, we can estimate the wave frequency and directional spectrum, as well as the wind stress. And we can say that the direct way to estimate the wind stress is this particular formula, which relies on the correlation of turbulent components of wind, U prime, W prime, and V prime and W prime. But as I mentioned earlier, the surface stress can also be estimated by the bulk formula, just with the mean wind speed at the square and imposing a drag coefficient. So we estimate this directly and calculate this indirectly. We can have a look at this at the drag coefficient and try to study the process. This is one of the main results. We can see that the drag coefficient as a function of wind speed shows also a tendency to decrease with the increase of wind speed from 1 meter per second to 7 or 8 meters per second. And for higher wind speeds, the drag coefficient increased almost linearly. So this is more or less typical character of the exchange coefficient during low wind conditions. Another interesting result that we obtain is because we managed to estimate the wind stress directly, you can see that this is a vector, right? So this vector has a direction. And if we compare the direction of that wind stress with the direction of the mean wind, this results as a function of the wind speed. What we can say here is that during low to moderate wind conditions, the direction of the wind stress is not aligned with the mean wind. It is aligned only for moderate to high wind conditions. This is really important because if we use the bulk formula in a numerical model, we always assume that the wind stress and the mean wind are aligned because it is only considered the intensity or magnitude of the wind stress. But measurements now reveal that this is not the case in many occasions. So several research documents were obtained from that experiment, and there are some main issues that we agree upon. That we obtain a wide range of wind speed, and we also observe a very important variability in our results. This site is very unique with conditions of wind sea opposing swell, which is the long waves coming from distant storms. But the important point here is that the swell steepness in the experiments was in a very limited range. So we need to explore also other relevant processes in the exchange. So we have the opportunity with a project by CONACYT CENER, the big experiment SIGOM, to develop and build buoys, meteorological and oceanographic spar buoys. We have some tests in Dos Santos Bay, and we deploy 3 of them in the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, not the 3 of them were working or functioning simultaneously. We deployed the first one in July in 2018, and later on the other 2. And at the end, we recovered the last one in January 2020. But at least we have some results of 2 of the buoys simultaneously. These buoys are enhanced spar buoys with more electronics and more sensors than before. And one important thing is that the electronics and the connections of the buoys were developed in our laboratory. The buoys had a sonic anemometer, a MET station, and we measure CO2 in air and water. And also they have 6 capacitance wave staff. Besides CTD with oxygen and PhD sensors, an acoustic Doppler current meter, and ADB within the base of the structure. Within the electronics, there was also a very fine motion sensor in order to detect the motion structure and to be able to correct all variables by means of the effect of the motion of the structure. So one particular and interesting thing from this measurement is that within the 6 capacitance wave gauge, which are located in the sides of this pentagon, which is the pentagon associated with the cage, we can estimate directly through the method by Donnellan, Duran, and Magnusson the directional wave spectrum. And this is a picture of it. So this is the directional wave spectrum. The colors are energy density spectrum for each frequency. Every circle is 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 hertz, and direction, which is north, east, south, and west. So this plot, this particular plot, which is the results from half an hour data center, or starting in 5:30 of 11 of September in 2018, indicates that the main wave energy was traveling to the west, and the waves spectral peak was about 0.2 hertz in frequency. The result from this analysis can also provide us with the wind speed, which is the blue arrow, the Stokes drift, which is the red, and the stress, which is the blue, dark blue arrow. So in this case, the waves were traveling towards the west, and the wind and the stress and the Stokes drift was also directed to the west. But this is not always the case. We obtained a result from this one, the 14th of September at 10:30, where we have two systems, two wave systems. And of course, the results of wind speed and Stokes drift and stress are with very different direction. So this is very interesting results, and we need to further analyze them in order to establish a better relation between the ocean surface waves and the wind stress. Besides, as I mentioned, we have an ADCP at the base of the structure looking upwards, like these lines are sketching. And this is a picture of the ADCP. And the idea is that this sensor has 5 acoustic beams. And in each acoustic beam, we can estimate the long beam velocity of the fluid particles in every cell, from the bottom of the structure right to the surface. The sensor was sampling at 16 hertz, so we have at 1/16th of a second a snapshot of a long beam velocities. So we need to reconstruct the most probably subsurface elevation field from that signal, and from a sequence of the estimated field, surface field, this will provide some evolution information. This is a very interesting problem. Maybe it's an ill-posed problem to be tackled in order to use the amount of information that we obtain from the ADCP and trying to reconstruct the sea surface evolution. So another topic of interest, looking at the ocean surface waves now from very far above, is using synthetic aperture radar. This is an example of an image obtained also during the INTO experiment as well in the Gulf of Tehuantepec. And here we can detect the coastline. This is the port of Salina Cruz and the port of Pemex right there. And also very distinct, we can detect the oil refinery and storage of Pemex in that region. What is important here is that we can clearly detect some features that tells us that there are waves present, right? I hope you can see them. And we did analysis of sub-images in a similar image from synthetic aperture radar, extract information from these 5 squares to estimate the directional wave spectrum. And we plot them again from similar to the directional wave spectrum that we showed before. In this case, we have wavelength 400, 200, and 100 meters. And the colors are also energy, or the energy density from the spectrum. So in this case, we can detect the evolution of the waves in terms of their directional wave spectrum when they travel towards the coast. So we can see here that in the far away square or sub-image, the waves can be detected only like traveling to the azimuth direction, which is practically 10 degrees off north. But in the when the waves are getting closer to the coastline, the variability increases, and we even obtain or detect two wave systems. So this is also a challenge in, well, before commenting about the challenge, let me show you some other results in the Gulf of Mexico for newer satellites, for newer synthetic aperture radars from satellites from the German laboratory and from the European Space Agency. And this is because we had at the same time measurements from BOM-1 at Perdido region in the Gulf of Mexico. So the time series that we are showing here is the wind speed in the top and significant wave height as obtained from the buoy. And the lines are when we obtain images either from TerraSAR-X or Tandem-X or the European Space Agency satellites, Sentinel-1A or 1B. Just as an example, I'll show you an image from Sentinel-1A in the 12th of September 2018. And the buoy side was this blue square. Well, what we can detect here is a feature that resembles an atmospheric front, the so-called cold fronts that trigger northerly winds in the Gulf of Mexico. And we estimate, we extract sub-images in that particular region, and we estimate the image spectrum from directly the sub-image, but we can also estimate the directional wave spectrum from the buoy. And this is the challenge, because we are still under testing and building the code, building the model to retrieve the information from wave spectrum from the direct information of image spectrum obtained by a synthetic aperture radar. So this is one problem that we are still working on it. And another example is the 16th of October 2018, when there was also another cold front. And in this case, at the time of the SAR image acquisition, the buoy was in this magenta cross. But we managed to estimate wave information in all these sub-images. And we can just show you the results of the directional wave spectrum from the buoy just before the front gets over the actual buoy. So the wind speed at this particular region is, at this particular time, is very low, almost 4 meters per second. So the light blue is the wind speed. And the stress and the Stokes drift are these arrows. And just when the actual front passes by the buoy, the wave conditions changes dramatically. And it is only a few hours or 1 hour difference between this signal to this signal and the results. And the wind speed is now very intense, 17.5 meters per second. And of course, the wind conditions are very different. And what is more important is the exchange coefficient, the momentum transfer, and even the Stokes drift are rather complex and difficult to estimate. And from the image, so this is as a function of time, description of what happens right in the station where the buoy was. But for that particular instant when the image was acquired, eastward from the front, we estimate this wave spectrum from the SAR image, and westward from the front, we estimate this one. So this is work under programs. We need to work on details of the retrieval of the directional wave spectrum from the image spectrum through inversion scheme, and then compared to what we obtain from the buoy. So this is one of the other challenges that we are facing in terms of applied maths, or in terms of data processing. So as final remarks and next step, so we just show that there is a great importance of the influence of the ocean surface waves on air-sea interaction. These ocean surface waves influence momentum and CO2 fluxes, for instance. We did some measurements and show results from fluxes at a coastal site, and we are facing and we are dealing with the detailed direct measurements, right, with sensors in the coast, but we would like to deploy this type of sensors in the buoy. We still don't have the CO2 turbulent fluctuation measurements in our buoy, but we are working on that. With this type of result, we can estimate very neatly the relative direction between mean wind and Stokes drift, which is rather important for oil transport, or sargasso transport, or any particles on the surface motion. Earth's interaction, momentum fluxes, directional waves, and surface currents in the uppermost part of the water column is one of the main interests in our research. And our particular research challenges, mainly associated with applied maths or data processing, is to estimate the surface elevation wave field from the ADCP data, essentially along with beam velocities in all cells as a function of the depth. And we anticipate that this is an ill-posed problem. Another particular challenge is the SAR image inversion. In other words, strictly speaking, the SAR image spectrum inversion to estimate the ocean surface wave directional spectrum. We would like to reach an inversion scheme, and the problem has to be solved for the various frequency bands that we are using, essentially X band from the German satellites and C band from the European Space Agency satellites. And with this, I finish. Thanks very much for your attention, and welcome any comment or questions.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. Dear audience, as you see at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat Q&A where you can write your question, or you can raise your hand, that yellow hand, and your microphone will be open. For instance, I see that Lili Guadarrama Bustos has a question, so please, will the technician open her microphone, please? Arturo? Any other? Okay, while we figure it out, I have a question. At the beginning, when you talk about when you show the Dalton number, in the second figure, you have an oscillatory behavior. In the first figure, it was clear that it was the graph was, the curve was decreasing, reach a minimum, and then was increasing. But in the second figure, you have at the beginning the same behavior, but then there was a kind of oscillatory behavior. Is there a physical reason for that? That you could comment?
Yes, I'll show the picture again.
Yes.
So this is for CO2.
Yes, and then in the second one, there is this kind of oscillatory behavior that looks quite interesting.
Yeah. It is quite important because we noticed that this increase is suddenly for higher winds than 3 meters per second, right? But then in the wave tank with 3, 4, 5, or 6 meters per second, the waves start to break, right? And then for 6, in wind speed conditions between 6 and 12, there was apparently, avoiding this dot, you could see that it is a rather constant Dalton number for winds between 6 and 12 meters per second, okay? And this is due to the wave breaking that this wind imposes. And for even higher wind conditions, the wave, of course, break mainly, the waves are increasing and mainly breaking, or you could say there is micro breaking under these conditions. But for higher winds, there is a strong breaking, and essentially the waves break very intensively in the end of the tank where there was a kind of beach. So yeah, there is a physical reason, no? There is microwave breaking all over these conditions of wind speed, and strong breaking increases suddenly the delta number or exchange coefficient for evaporation. Yeah.
We thank you. Is there any comment or question? Well, I have many, but let me just ask another one. There is a lot of data generated in these studies. If there's anybody interested, is that data available? Or
Yes, definitely. We welcome any collaboration. So we could easily can provide you with the data, and if needed, we can collaborate and do some things in our group and some other things by any other possible collaborator. Yeah, we are open to collaboration, and definitely we can share the data.
thank you. There is let me see, I'm learning to. There is Fabricio Otniel with a question. Please open his microphone.
Hello, good morning.
Fabricio, cheers.
Hola, doctor. Good morning. Cheers. Good morning. I have a question. We know that from centuries, the humankind has been modeled ocean wave spectra. From the point of view of a physical oceanographer, what do you think is the state of the art of this modeling about ocean wave spectrum?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we consider modeling the ocean surface wave spectrum, there are two things, right? One is to have a specific model spectrum, like Pearson-Moskowitz, like Jones-Swap, so on. But on the other hand, it is the subject of numerical model to predict the ocean surface waves or the ocean surface wave spectrum, right?
Okay.
So what is your question regarding the typical model spectrum? like JONSWAP or
Yeah, my question
numerical.
is more about the data. Yes, data, because I know there are many models, like you have said before, but more on numerical modeling, for example, because you showed us many spectra that comes from data. So I would like to know more about this modeling and the state of the art about this.
Okay, the spectrum that I'm showing now is directly from the data that we obtain from BOM1, the buoy in the Gulf of Mexico. And,
okay.
And
so the more modeling you make with numerical data, then you can find a kind of universal spectrum. Am I right?
No.
Okay.
Universal spectrum is useful, but it's only very idealistic.
Okay.
That's why I'm very interested in showing you direct results from measurements like the one we see here, right?
Yes.
Because at one time we have this kind of a spectrum, and suddenly we change everything. So instead of one wave system, now we have two, and all conditions are rather different, you see. So it is not possible to have a universal wave spectrum.
Okay.
In this region, we can show it clearly here, right?
Okay. So there is a lot of work to do with data in order to find a specific spectrum just for a certain region in the ocean. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is a question by Joaquin Delgado. Please open his microphone.
Okay, thank you. Very nice talk. Thank you, Francisco. I just want to know if there are some kind of rough models, not with such detail, but just to have a global view of the interaction of the ocean and the air. And I'm thinking about like Rayleigh-Benard model convections, of course, with the appropriate modifications. Can you give a basic reference on that?
I'm afraid not. I know that there are models, and as you said, focused most on the global scale. And what we want to stress with this type of work and this talk is that behind or before those global models, we better understand more detail of air-sea interaction processes, because it is within the we could say micro scale, that is the fundamentals required to be well understood before going to broader scale. Because if you go to broader scale or you work with broader scale, a very easy thing to do is, for instance, in the case of momentum transfer, is to use this equation, which is the bulk formula for wind stress. But the results obtained from our experiments and from other authors as well show that, for instance, just as an example, the direction of the mean stress, the direction of the stress, wind stress, is not always aligned with the mean wind. So that's the difficulties in using this type of a scheme in order to express or explain global scale characteristics, which then erase all details and variability that is really there. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have time for another question or comment. One. Okay. Well, I have many questions, but I will ask that personally to Francisco. that inverse problem on the ADCP measurement to surface wave elevation sounds very interesting, but I will write personally very soon. Okay. Well, we thank again Professor Ocampo for his talk, and we have a coffee break, and we resume at 12:30. Thank you very much to all, and thank you, Francisco Ocampo, again for the talk.
Thank you very much.